"You are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it." With these words, Jesus Christ supposedly invested his leading apostle, a Jewish fisherman named Simon Bar-Jonah, with the office that Catholics call the papacy, a ministry responsible for maintaining Christ's church in universal unity and universal orthodoxy. And this Christ-given ministry, so Catholics claim, was entrusted by Peter to the Church of Rome after the apostles settled in Rome, where he ended his days, crucified upside down atop Vatican Hill. But is there any truth behind this Catholic tradition? A tradition that's the very source of the Catholic Church's claims to authority. Does the Bible support it? Indeed, is there any evidence that the Apostle Peter ever set foot in Rome? My name is Aurelian, and you're watching CatholicSanity. According to the consensus of the ancient Church Fathers, Peter presided as Bishop of Rome, that is Rome's first pope, for 25 years prior to his martyrdom, which along with that of the Apostle Paul, is said to have taken place under Emperor Nero in AD 67. This ancient belief of Peter ruling and dying in Rome as its founding apostle is referenced by many of the earliest church writers, such as Clement of Rome, Ignatius of Antioch, Irenaeus of Lyon, Dionysius of Corinth, Clement of Alexandria, and many more. It should also be mentioned that not one ancient author, whether Christian or pagan, Orthodox or heretic, ever disputes or denies that Peter was the first bishop of Rome, or that Rome is rightly called the See of Peter. However, as Protestants and other non-Catholics are happy to point out, the New Testament itself doesn't say a word about this. Nor, for that matter, does the New Testament give us any solid information about how the City Church of Rome came to be, or who actually founded it. Indeed, apart from very detailed descriptions of Peter's early activities in the Holy Land in the first 12 chapters of the Acts of the Apostles, the Bible is almost completely silent about the latter years of Peter's apostolic ministry. But why would this be so? Indeed, after telling us a great deal about Peter's leadership of the infant church and his powerful witness to Christ in Jerusalem, Samaria, and the rest of Judea, the New Testament seems to veer dramatically away from Peter and tells us almost nothing about the culmination of his very important ministry, or how his life actually ended. This is both conspicuous and very strange. For aside from a brief but important mention in Acts 15, and a handful of passing, mostly incidental comments in the epistles of Paul, the scriptures tell us nothing specific about Peter or his ministry after Acts chapter 12. That is, with the sole exception of a short but very noteworthy statement made by the apostle himself at the very end of the first epistle of Peter, which seems to cast some light on his final whereabouts. Here the apostle says, "I write you this briefly through Silvanus. The chosen one at Babylon sends you greetings, as does Mark my son." So what are we to make of this? Was Peter literally writing from Babylon, a city located in modern-day Iraq? While some fundamentalists like to interpret the passage this way, once we look deeper and with an appreciation for the contemporary history, such an interpretation quickly becomes untenable. First of all, the literal city of Babylon, where the Jews of the Old Testament were exiled for 70 years, was in the lifetime of Peter reduced to an insignificant village well outside of the Roman Empire, in the middle of hostile Parthian territory. This we know from the first century geographer Strabo. And while it's quite possible that there was a small community of Jews living there, the vast majority of Jews in the region would have lived in the Parthian capital of Ctesiphon, modern-day Baghdad, not a little backwater town like first century Babylon. And there is no tradition of Peter ever traveling to or evangelizing Ctesiphon, Babylon, or any other part of the Parthian Empire, Rather, the few scant mentions of Peter's activities in the Pauline epistles place him in Western Roman cities, such as Antioch and Corinth, not in the Parthian East. What's more, notice how in his statement from 1 Peter, the apostle mentions both Silvanus, also known as Silas, and Mark, two figures who are known to us from other passages of the New Testament, and who were associated with Paul's evangelization efforts in Greece and Italy, not Iraq or the Middle East. Mark is directly mentioned as being in Rome with Paul in his epistle to Philemon 24, and in 2 Timothy 4:11, Paul asked Timothy to bring Mark to Rome. This is, of course, the same Mark who is the author of the gospel that bears his name, a gospel which, as most scholars agree, was almost certainly penned in Rome. So why does Peter claim that he is writing from Babylon? Well, notice how he puts it. The chosen one at Babylon sends you greetings. By the chosen one, Peter is of course referring to his local church, an important church, a principal or leading church, which he says is located at Babylon, that is, in a place of worldly exile, as the term was commonly used in Jewish expression. And Peter is not the only one to employ this term symbolically in the New Testament. Rather, 6 times in the book of Revelation, the Apostle John uses the term Babylon as a common Christian code name for imperial pagan Rome, a place set like Rome itself on 7 hills, as John says in Revelation 17, which is drunk with the blood of the saints and those who have borne witness to Jesus. So likewise, writing at a time when the Church of Rome was under full-blown persecution by the imperial Roman government, Peter understandably uses a code word, which the church's enemies were unlikely to understand, and so speaks of his location as not Rome, but Babylon. And once we appreciate Peter's need to do this, that is, the early church's apparent need to protect Peter and safeguard his whereabouts against enemies who would surely target him as the principal leader of the early underground and persecuted Christian community, we can also then appreciate why the New Testament would suddenly become either silent or conspicuously evasive when describing Peter's activities and achievements. To understand this fully, let's return to the point in the New Testament narrative when Peter ceases to be the central character in the story. This once again takes place in Acts chapter 12, where we are told how King Herod Agrippa came to the throne of Judea and began to persecute the infant church in Jerusalem. Here, Acts 12 tells us, Herod had James, the brother of John, killed by the sword, and when he saw that this was pleasing to the Jews, he proceeded to arrest Peter also. He intended to bring him before the people after Passover. But rather than face execution and martyrdom at this time, Acts tells us that Peter is miraculously freed from prison by an angel. He then goes in secret to the house of Mark's mother, where many members of the Jerusalem church are gathered that night to pray for him. We are then told, he explained to them how the Lord led him out of the prison and said, "Report this to James and the brothers." Then he left and went to another place. At this point, Peter totally disappears from the Acts narrative, and we do not hear about him again until he inexplicably reappears at the so-called Council of Jerusalem in Acts 15, which was at least 7 years later. So where was Peter all this time? Indeed, where did the leader of the apostles, a wanted man, now marked for death by the Jerusalem authorities, flee to in the middle of the night? Acts simply says he went to another place. But Catholic tradition has always understood this other place to be a cryptic reference to Rome. Now, if one isn't a Catholic, such a claim might seem dubious, if not outright ridiculous, a clear and shameless example of papist propaganda. But if we bother to look a bit deeper, and with an appreciation of both the historical context of this story and the overall theme of the book of Acts, which is essentially the spread of the gospel from Jerusalem to Rome, the traditional Catholic interpretation is actually much stronger than it might at first appear. To begin, let's look at the timing. Acts 12 is describing a series of events that took place shortly after King Herod Agrippa came to the throne of Judea and was trying to ingratiate himself with the temple priests and other Jewish authorities there. Now, Herod Agrippa's reign marked an important transition for the fledgling church in Jerusalem. Before this time, and during all of the church's activities from the day of Pentecost on, Judea was under the direct rule of the Roman Empire and governed by Roman procurators like Pontius Pilate. This made it very difficult for the religious authorities in their efforts to stomp out the followers of Jesus, who the Romans viewed as just another bothersome but relatively harmless Jewish sect. Now, Herod Agrippa was actually residing in Rome when he was made king of all Judea by his childhood friend, the Emperor Claudius. This took place sometime early in AD 41, after the assassination of Emperor Caligula on the 24th of January. And according to both Josephus and Cassius Dio, Herod Agrippa was given independent rule over Judea as a reward for helping Claudius to avoid his own assassination and acquire the imperial throne. Now, since this all took place in winter, it's not very likely, given the dangers of Roman sea travel, that Herod Agrippa would have returned to Judea to claim his new kingdom in time for the Passover of AD 41. Yet since Passover is mentioned in the Acts 12 narrative, that is, Herod was waiting for Passover to end before bringing Peter to trial and execution, this almost certainly places the story in either March or April of AD 42, the very same year in which Catholic tradition cites the beginning of Peter's 25-year tenure as Bishop of Rome. For example, the 4th century church historian Eusebius of Caesarea, who is drawing from much earlier sources, tells us, in the second year of the 205th Olympiad, AD 42, the Apostle Peter is sent to Rome, where he remains as bishop of that city, preaching the gospel for 25 years. Likewise, the church father Jerome records, Simon Peter, the son of John, having preached to the diaspora, pushed on to Rome in the second year of Claudius, AD 42, and held the sacerdotal chair there for 25 years, until the last, that is the 14th year of Nero, AD 67. Now, at this point, a skeptic might very well say, so what? What obviously could have happened here is that some ancient Catholic authors, like Eusebius and Jerome, took a simple meaningless phrase in Acts chapter 12, that is, Peter fleeing to another place, which just happened to occur in AD 42, and applied it to their extra-scriptural timetable for Peter presiding over the Church of Rome for 25 years. In other words, one could very easily accuse the Church Fathers of force-fitting their tradition to correspond to this story, or even inventing the tradition based on a mere offhanded remark used by the author of Acts. And that might very well seem like a viable possibility. However, once we explore what else the New Testament presents to us chronologically about Peter, it becomes very obvious that far more is at play. But first, let's consider Peter's present predicament. Here he was in Acts 12, having miraculously escaped prison in Jerusalem in the middle of the night. He was now officially a wanted man, and wanted by a very powerful political force that had just executed his fellow apostle James Bar Zebedee. Indeed, James was the first member of the 12 to be martyred, and his death must have been a major blow to the infant church, striking at the very heart of the Jerusalem church's hierarchy. And while the angel's intervention deprived Herod of an even greater victory, the story of Peter's deliverance actually reveals an unprecedented crisis which Herod's persecution caused. For notice what Peter says, and also what he does not say, to the believers assembled in Mark's mother's house. He specifically tells them to report his escape to James. By this he means Jesus' so-called brother James, also known as James the Just, who was not one of the apostles, but who was now, and from this point on, the recognized leader of the Jerusalem church. not John or Matthew or Andrew or Philip or any of the apostles. And what this obviously reveals is that the other apostles were no longer based in Jerusalem at this time, but had apparently fled the holy city, and likely all of Judea, in reaction to James Bar Zebedee's execution and Peter's arrest. But to that point, where was Peter himself, now a fugitive, to go? He could not flee home to Galilee, or Samaria, or Idumea, or to any other parts of Palestine, because Herod Agrippa was now ruler of all these places. Indeed, unlike his uncle Herod Antipas, the ruler of Galilee, who executed John the Baptist, Herod Agrippa was no petty Jewish client king, but the sovereign master of the entire territory ruled by his grandfather, Herod the Great, a true Oriental monarch with strong regional influence, even with the Roman governors of neighboring Syria and Egypt. This meant that Peter could not remain in the region, but by necessity he had to flee somewhere very far away in order to escape Herod's reach. So could that place have been Rome? Before dismissing such a possibility as extreme or unrealistic, let's consider what kind of opportunities and assets Peter had at his disposal. 2 chapters earlier in Acts 10, we are told how Peter, while in Caesarea, was the first among the apostles to bring Gentiles into the church, namely the Roman centurion Cornelius and his family, who were thereafter Peter's immediate disciples. And as Acts 10 tells us, Cornelius was the commander in a military cohort called Italica, which was an auxiliary unit of archers recruited in central Italy near Rome. So when Cornelius and his family, and presumably their associates, Peter had very influential Roman allies with direct connections to Italy. What's more, as we know from Acts 2:10 and also Romans 16:7, 16:11, and 16:13, there were numerous Roman Jews who were believers in Christ since the day of Pentecost, including some relatives of the Apostle Paul, who Paul tells us were well known to the apostles, and also Rufus, who is almost certainly the same Rufus mentioned in Mark 15:21, the son of Simon of Cyrene, who helped Jesus carry his cross. This being the case, Peter actually possessed a very sizable network of contacts in Italy, who could both arrange his transport and welcome him safely at Rome. But before we try the patience of skeptics any further, let's for now simply agree that Peter clearly must have gone somewhere, whether to Rome or somewhere else, that was well beyond King Herod Agrippa's grasp. And he must have remained there, or at least away from Judea, until after the death of Herod in AD 44. But to shed further light on where his place of exile was, let's now consider Peter's mysterious reappearance in Acts 15, where without a word of explanation, he's again back in Jerusalem to participate in a council of the apostles and leading presbyters of the church to determine whether or not Gentile Christians needed to be circumcised and observe the Mosaic law. This event took place about 7 years after Peter was forced to flee from Herod Agrippa, and so approximately AD 49. And this date corresponds very neatly, if not perfectly, with an otherwise obscure reference in the Roman historical record, which tells us that, just about this time, most likely in AD 49 itself, the Emperor Claudius expelled all the Jews from Rome because of riots involving someone named Chrestus. As the Roman historian Suetonius describes it, as the Jews were making constant disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, the Emperor Claudius expelled them from Rome. Now, it doesn't take much imagination to conclude, as many scholars do, that Suetonius's Chrestus is a mishearing of Christus, that is Latin for Christ. And so, at the instigation of Chrestus, could easily mean that the Jews in Rome were triggered or conflicted violently over the teachings of this Christus, that is Christ. Still, other scholars, it must be noted, see no Christian connection here at all, pointing out that Christus was a common name among Roman slaves, a name meaning useful or helpful, and that Suetonius' statement likely, but not necessarily, implies that Christus himself was present in Rome as the source of the unrest. Still, these same observations can just as easily be used to explain why the pagan Suetonius would confuse a reference to Jesus Christ with the common name Christus, and it's likely that even Suetonius himself presumed that this Christ was personally present in Rome and instigating the riots, rather than only being the cause of the riots incidentally through his teachings. Whatever the case, what cannot be denied is that Peter reappears in the Acts narrative and is back in Jerusalem at exactly the same time when Jews like himself were expelled from the city of Rome, and almost certainly because of a conflict between Jewish believers in Christ and their disbelieving brethren. This, I would argue, is backed up by the fact that the author of Acts also makes note of this otherwise obscure incident. For in Acts 18, 1-2, we are told, "After this Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. There he met a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had ordered all the Jews to leave Rome." Here it must be noted that if we read Acts 18 carefully, Paul does not convert Aquila or his wife Priscilla to the Christian faith. Rather, they are already Christian believers and part of the very same Jewish Christian community at Rome, which Paul addresses years later in Romans 16, written after Jews were permitted to return to the imperial capital. And what this demonstrates, rather conclusively, is that Emperor Claudius's expulsion of the Jews clearly had something to do with Jewish believers in Christ. Indeed, the Roman historian Cassius Dio reinforces this position by apparently contradicting both Suetonius and Acts and maintaining that all the Jews were not expelled from Rome. He writes, "As for the Jews, who had again increased so greatly that by reason of their multitude it would have been hard without raising a tumult to bar them from the city, Claudius did not drive them out, but ordered them, while continuing their traditional mode of life, not to hold meetings." In other words, it was clearly not the entire Jewish community of Rome that was driven from the city, but only the supposed troublemakers, almost certainly the Jewish Christians, who were disturbing the community with their novel insistence that Jesus is the Messiah. So was Peter one of these Jewish troublemakers in Rome? Indeed, was he their leader? The narrative of Acts strongly suggests that he was. Here once again we have Peter disappearing in AD 42, exactly when Catholic tradition says he became the first bishop of Rome, and we have him back in Judea on or about AD 49, at exactly the time when he would have been temporarily deported from Rome, along with other Jewish Christians. Without directly stating it, the author of Acts perfectly reflects the traditional timetable, apparently presuming that his original readers were already familiar with the events surrounding Peter's disappearance and reappearance in the narrative. Now, as we know from Romans 16, the Jewish Christians were eventually permitted to return to Rome, either late in the reign of Claudius or in the early part of Emperor Nero's reign. And this once again fits very nicely with the traditional Catholic belief that Peter himself returned to Rome and resumed his place as the rightful leader of the Roman Church, after also governing the Church of Antioch for a time. But to many Protestants and other non-Catholics who rely on the biblical record alone, this Catholic tradition seems rather ridiculous. After all, if Peter was presiding over the Roman Church in the late 50s or early 60s, why doesn't Paul ever mention him in his epistle to the Romans? Especially in Romans 16, when Paul greets many other members of the Roman Church, including Aquila and Priscilla. Now, while this may seem at first like a valid criticism, if we're going to call things ridiculous, then we do well to explore what Paul actually says and does not say in his epistle to the Romans. Firstly, in Romans 1:13-14, Paul mentions his long-held desire to visit the Church of Rome, saying, "I have often planned to come to you, though I was prevented until now, that I might harvest some fruits among you too, as among the rest of the Gentiles, to Greeks and non-Greeks alike, to the wise and the ignorant, I am under obligation. That is why I am eager to preach the gospel also to you in Rome. So Paul's desire to harvest some fruit in Rome was based on his personal ministry as the apostle to the Gentiles, Rome being the most populous center and the very capital of the Gentile world. And the epistle to the Romans itself is addressed primarily to Gentiles, the Roman Church possessing a very large Gentile Christian population, which Paul himself did not establish. Yet in Romans 11:13-14, he writes, "Now I am speaking to you Gentiles. Inasmuch then as I am the apostle to the Gentiles, I glory in my ministry, in order to make my race jealous and thus save some of them." So Paul, the apostle to the Gentiles, was planning to come to Rome in order to establish solidarity with the pre-existing Gentile Christian population there, and also to help evangelize the countless Gentiles in Rome who were still pagans. This seems pretty simple and straightforward. That is, until we consider what he also says in Romans 15:18-24. Here he writes, "For I will not dare to speak of anything except what Christ has accomplished through me, to lead the Gentiles to obedience, by word and deed, by the power of signs and wonders, by the power of the Spirit of God, so that from Jerusalem all the way around to Illyricum, I have finished preaching the gospel of Christ. Thus I aspire to proclaim the gospel, not where Christ has already been named, so that I do not build on another man's foundation. But now, since I no longer have any opportunity in these regions, and since I have desired to come to you for many years, I hope to see you in passing, as I go to Spain, and to be sent on my way there by you, after I have enjoyed being with you for a time." Now earlier I mentioned calling things ridiculous. Well, here what Paul says could not be more ridiculous or nonsensical if we are to believe that the Roman Church is without an apostolic shepherd at this time. Indeed, we are talking about first-century Rome, the capital of the Roman Empire and the largest city in the world, a city with a population of about 1 million souls, and so the most fertile territory possible for evangelizing the Gentiles, the very ministry which Paul is supposedly committed to. Indeed, if we compare Rome to any of the large cities which Paul previously evangelized, such as Ephesus or Thessalonica or Corinth, these all seem puny by comparison. And as we are told in Acts 18:11 and Acts 19:10, Paul spent 18 months in Corinth and about 2 years in Ephesus. But does Paul plan to spend even a comparable amount of time in Rome? Apparently not. Rather, he tells the Romans that he merely intends to see them in passing, as he makes his way to evangelize the cities in Spain, and he expresses his desire that the Roman Christians should help him to do this. So what in the world is going on here? Why would Paul, the apostle to the Gentiles, who spent years evangelizing significantly smaller Gentile communities in the Eastern Mediterranean, essentially pass up an opportunity to evangelize the largest and most important Gentile center in the world, a place where his gospel would be heard not only by the 1 million residents of the city itself, but also by countless others who passed through Rome from throughout the empire on a regular basis? This doesn't make any sense. Unless, of course, Rome was already in very capable apostolic hands. And as we've already seen, Paul himself makes reference to this in Romans 15 when he writes, "Thus I aspire to proclaim the gospel, not where Christ has already been named, so I do not build on another man's foundation." This is clearly why Paul doesn't intend to focus his ministry in Rome itself, because the Church of Rome has already been founded and established by someone else. And so this, of course, begs the question, who is this other man? who is the founder of the Church of Rome? Well, the biblical record seems to present us with two very important clues to this person's identity. Firstly, if we consider Paul's own terminology, whenever he speaks of the foundation of a city church, Paul always refers to an apostle. For example, in Ephesians 2:19-20, he writes, "So you are no longer strangers, but members of the household of God, built upon the foundation of the apostles and prophets, with Jesus Christ himself as the capstone." Likewise, speaking of himself and his own apostolic ministry at Corinth, Paul writes, "According to the grace given to me, like a wise master builder, I laid a foundation, and another is building upon it." So again, who laid the foundation for the Church of Rome? It must have been an apostle, someone comparable to Paul himself. And as we've already seen, and as evidenced by Paul's epistle to the Romans, the Church of Rome had a very large Gentile membership. So who among the apostles, aside from Paul and his associates, was known to evangelize Gentiles as well as Jews? Well, according to what we are told repeatedly in Scripture, the only apostle aside from Paul who was known for ministering to Gentiles was Peter. For as we mentioned in Acts chapter 10, it is Peter, even prior to the start of Paul's ministry, who brings the first Gentiles into the church. And in his address to the Council of Jerusalem in Acts 15:7, Peter rather proudly proclaims, "My brothers, you are well aware that from early days God made his choice among you, that through my mouth the Gentiles would hear the word of the gospel and believe." Thus it serves to reason, or at the very least, it must strongly be considered, that Peter was responsible for establishing the Roman Church, with its sizable Gentile membership. Indeed, if it was not Peter, then the Church of Rome, the most populous and most important Christian community in the ancient church, was founded and led by an otherwise unknown but very prominent apostle, an apostle who was important enough for Paul to defer to, but about whom we know absolutely nothing. And given these two choices, between Peter and someone totally unknown, which seems more probable and more consistent with Scripture? So what are we to conclude? Simply this: the Bible as we have it intentionally avoids mentioning Peter's activities in Rome because of what amounted to security concerns. That is, to protect Peter's Christ-given ministry of leadership during a time of brutal persecution. This easily explains why Paul doesn't greet or mention Peter in Romans 16, and why Peter himself describes his location using a code word in 1 Peter. Likewise, the Acts of the Apostles avoids mentioning Peter's presence in Rome because Acts was almost certainly composed to aid the Apostle Paul in his first trial before the emperor, and so mentioning Peter's Roman activities, which would include the so-called Crestus riot and the subsequent expulsion of Christian Jews in the time of Claudius, obviously wouldn't have helped Paul's case. All this, of course, is just strong speculation. But let's recount what is indisputable. The universal witness of the early church, and of its enemies, consistently claimed that Peter was the founding apostle and the first bishop of Rome, and that Rome was the See of Peter, that is, the place of Peter's episcopal chair and apostolic authority. In the first epistle of Peter, the apostle himself refers to his location as Babylon, which was unquestionably an early Christian code name for Rome. In Acts chapter 12, which takes place in AD 42, Peter flees Judea for another place, which early Christian tradition identifies as Rome, and it's from this very time that the early Christian writers count the beginning of Peter's 25-year tenure as Bishop of Rome. In Acts chapter 15, which takes place in or about AD 49, Peter mysteriously reappears in Judea for the Council of Jerusalem. and this is concurrent with an event in which many Jews, most likely the Jewish Christians, were expelled from Rome because of the civil unrest over someone named Christus in the Roman Jewish community. Christus almost certainly being a mishearing of Christ. And in his epistle to the Romans, Paul primarily addresses a sizable Gentile Christian community in Rome, which was not established by Paul himself, the apostle to the Gentiles, but was a foundation laid by another man. And this other man, another apostle, was both important enough and capable enough to make Paul's evangelization plans focus on Spain rather than Rome. These 5 points cannot be denied, and while they are perhaps not enough to sway the more skeptical or more prejudiced of thinkers, they do at the very least establish that it is quite reasonable to believe that the Catholic tradition is correct and in full accord with the Bible, and that the Apostle Peter most certainly was the founder and first bishop of the Church of Rome. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please leave your comments, and please like and subscribe for more Catholic Sanity. Pax Christi vobiscum.